Imagine you run a local coffee shop. You might think your barista's job is, completely safe from the AI revolution because, let's face it, a computer can't physically steam milk.
Right. Or pour that intricate latte art.
Exactly. But what if I told you that making the actual coffee only accounts for about 11% of what you pay them to do? Welcome to the deep dive. You're here today because you want to cut through the noise of those endless office debates.
The water cooler arguments that just go in circles.
Yeah, exactly. You want the definitive answer to the ultimate question. Is the AI revolution going to take our jobs, or is it just going to change them?
It really is the central anxiety of the decade. And to get into it, we're looking at a 2026 paper by Jonathan H. Westover. It's titled When the Escape Routes Close, and it heavily relies on this massive empirical data set by a researcher named Van Vugt.
And what makes this stack of notes so compelling today is that it's the mission of this deep dive, right? We're trying to figure out if the historical pattern that technology always creates more jobs than it destroys, if that's finally breaking.
Right. And if AI is getting so incredibly advanced, why haven't we seen a catastrophic wave of mass layoffs in the headlines?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because there is this pervasive premise out there. I hear it all the time. People say, look, we panicked about the tractor, we panicked about the computer. Tech always creates new industries.
Oh, absolutely. Screaming, "This time is different," has basically been a punchline among economists for 200 years.
Yeah, you look foolish if you bet against human innovation.
Right. Because historically, that comfort was entirely justified. I mean, look back to the 1810s. Mechanized looms came in and utterly displaced hand weavers.
But they didn't just starve.
Now, those weavers were able to go work on the factory floors.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing in the 1920s. Automated switchboards eliminated telephone operators, but they transitioned into receptionist roles. Economists point to this historical resilience, and it was built on a structural reality of the labor market that Westover calls escape routes.
Escape routes, meaning like you could take your underlying human abilities and just apply them somewhere else.
Yes, exactly. Specifically, through skill transferability and domain switching. This previous technology was fundamentally narrow. The power loom conquered weaving, sure, but it left human cognition completely untouched.
Great, the machine didn't know how to think.
Exactly, even the early computer.
Yeah.
It conquered repetitive calculation, but it couldn't conduct, interpersonal communication. So if a machine took over your specific daily task, you still possessed a suite of underlying skills. Manual dexterity, verbal communication, critical thinking that were highly valuable in adjacent occupations.
There was always an escape route.
Yes. The economy was always expanding into territories that machines simply couldn't reach.
Which brings us to Van Vugt's 2026 dataset, which is really the absolute core of today's deep dive. Van Vugt didn't just look at AI as this broad, scary, abstract concept.
No, they got incredibly granular.
Yeah, they broke down human labor into the U.S. Department of Labor's 87 standardized occupational skills. We're talking about the fundamental building blocks of literally every job.
And they tracked the frontier of AI capability against those 87 skills. But they made a critical distinction that honestly usually gets lost when we talk about this stuff. They focused on economic cost parity.
Not just technical capability.
Exactly. Not just what it can do in a lab.
I want to make sure we really understand that mechanism because a flashy tech demo is very different from what a small business owner will actually pay for.
Right. Economic cost parity is the only metric that actually threatens a paycheck. Think about it this way. If a cutting-edge AI system can write a brilliant, nuanced legal brief, but it requires massive amounts of server power.
Like it costs 10 times more than a human.
Yeah, exactly. Then the paralegal keeps their job. The technology is capable, but it's not economically viable. So Van Oort measured the exact moment when AI systems could match or exceed the median human performance on a specific skill for equal or less money.
And when you look at those numbers, well, the acceleration is what stops you in your tracks. In 2020, AI had hit cost parity on just 16% of those foundational skills. By 2025,
It had reached 62%.
62%.
The frontier isn't just creeping forward, it is sprinting. We are seeing rapid saturation in cognitive and communicative skills, written expression, deductive reasoning, reading comprehension.
Which are everywhere.
Right. These are not niche abilities limited to one industry. They're the bedrock of hundreds of different occupations simultaneously.
There's this analogy in the text from the philosopher Nick Bostrom, and it creates a terrifyingly clear visual for this. He says we should imagine human capability as a box.
I love this analogy.
Yeah, historically, technological progress was like sand trickling into the corners of that box. It filled up the heavy physical labor corner, it filled up the rote calculation corner. But the vast center of the box, our cognitive work, was empty and safe.
You could just stand in the middle.
Right. But now, the sand isn't trickling into the corners. The sand is rising evenly across the entire box all at once.
Because if AI reaches cost parity on written expression, it doesn't just displace freelance writers, it immediately shifts the competitive balance for marketing analysts, paralegals, mid-level managers.
Basically, anyone who uses writing as a core function of their day.
Exactly. The skill itself is under pressure everywhere.
But wait, let me push back a bit and pause on that barista example we opened with. You mentioned earlier that AI can't pour latte art,
Right.
which falls under what's called Moravec's paradox, this idea that high-level reasoning is easy for computers, but basic sensory-motor skills like walking upstairs or grasping a delicate cup are incredibly difficult.
Very difficult for machines, yes.
So doesn't that paradox mean physical, hands-on jobs are the ultimate safe haven?
It's a great question. Moravec's paradox is absolutely real, but the Van Vook data dismantles the idea that it fully protects workers. Let's look closely at that barista. Making the actual physical drink requires multi-limb coordination in an unpredictable environment.
Which AI stinks at.
Which AI stinks at. So that part is heavily protected by Moravec's paradox. But pouring the latte is only 11.9% of the job's required skill profile.
Wait, 11%?
Less than 12%, yeah. The other 88.1% involves shift scheduling, interacting with customers, verifying order accuracy, managing inventory.
Wow.
Right. AI can automate the massive non-physical bulk of the role. You don't need a $50,000 humanoid robot to reduce your barista headcount. You just implement a localized AI system to handle the ordering, the inventory, and the customer service.
Which drastically shrinks the overall human time required to run the shop.
Exactly.
So if the sand is rising across the whole box and AI is automating 88% of barista's job and writing briefs better than paralegals, I'm trying to square this with reality. We aren't seeing catastrophic layoff announcements dominating the news every day. Where's the fallout?
The fallout is happening quietly. The data calls it a hiring deceleration. Mass layoffs are terrible for business.
Yeah, bad PR.
Bad PR, massive severance payouts, destroyed morale for the remaining staff, legal risks. So instead of firing, companies are just utilizing natural turnover.
Right.
When someone quits or retires or moves on,
Simply don't replace them.
precisely.
Anthropic released some fascinating data on this in early 2026. They looked at highly AI-exposed jobs, and they found that the bottom rung of the corporate ladder is essentially being sawed off.
Yeah, the entry-level impact is stark.
There was a 14% drop in entry-level hiring specifically targeting 22 to 25-year-olds. Nearly 1 in 6 entry-level jobs for recent college grads just vanished because AI is now perfectly capable of doing that junior-level foundational work.
And we can see the exact mechanism of this in some of the corporate case studies Westover highlights. Take Klarna, the fintech company. They integrated an AI assistant that, by their own metrics, handled the workload of 700 full-time customer service agents.
700 agents, but they didn't fire 700 people.
No, they didn't announce a layoff. They instituted strict hiring freezes and let normal attrition run its course. They shrank their global workforce by more than 20% over 18 months without a single negative headline.
I noticed JP Morgan and Duolingo did similar things in the text. JP Morgan saved 360,000 hours on legal review, and Duolingo localized more content while quietly shedding their contractor translators.
It's all about doing more with a smaller core team.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. This isn't an economic earthquake that knocks the house down overnight. It is a slow leak in a tire. It's substitution by stealth. You don't realize you're stranded until you try to drive the car and the rim is grinding against the pavement.
That is a perfect analogy. And that slow leak hits certain workers much harder than others, creating what the text calls the collapse of mediocrity.
Oof, the collapse of mediocrity.
Yeah, let's look at the actual performance data. In 2020, technology outperformed the bottom quartile of professionals, so the bottom 25% on only about 29% of those 87 foundational skills.
Okay.
But by 2025, technology outperformed that same bottom quartile on 84% of skills.
I want you, the listener, to put yourself in those shoes for a second. Imagine you're at the 40th percentile of your job. You aren't the absolute superstar of the office, but you're competent. You do the work. You meet your deadlines. Being average has historically been completely fine for maintaining stable employment.
It was the norm.
Right. But now, an employer can get near median performance on the vast majority of your daily tasks for roughly 30% of the cost of your salary.
And the immediate casualty of that dynamic is bargaining power. If a 40th percentile worker tries to negotiate a raise or attempts to make a lateral move to a competitor, they find the doors are closed. The result is intense wage stagnation. But Westover points out an even deeper consequence.
That's a psychological side.
Yes, the painful erosion of our occupational identities.
We aren't just losing discrete tasks. We're losing the fundamental thing we tell people we are at dinner parties, right? I am a data analyst. I am a copywriter.
Exactly. If a machine does what you spent a decade mastering, and it does it instantly, is an existential blow to how you view your place in society.
The psychological resilience we saw in past automation waves came from having those alternative pathways. A factory worker displaced by a robotic welding arm could realistically say, well, I will go learn machine maintenance.
But when AI simultaneously reaches cost parity on writing, analyzing, and researching, those genuine alternatives just evaporate.
So if this quiet displacement is happening right under our noses, how are corporations actually managing the humans caught in the middle? The source material details a few strategies, but reading through them, they feel a lot more like corporate band-aids than actual cures.
Many of them absolutely are. One approach gaining traction is simply transparent communication. Dropbox serves as a prime example here.
The difficult honesty approach.
Right. When they cut a significant portion of their staff, their leadership explicitly told the company, look, this is not a temporary economic downturn. We are fundamentally redesigning a smaller team for an AI-augmented reality.
Which sounds brutal on the surface, but the psychological research in the paper indicates employees actually prefer that truth to, vague corporate jargon about synergy and restructuring.
Yeah, workers generally trust leaders who acknowledge reality over those who offer false certainty. But honest communication about losing your job doesn't change the material reality that you are out of a paycheck.
Obviously. Which naturally leads us to the strategy we hear promoted constantly. Capability development or retraining. Everyone says, just learn to work alongside AI.
The great pivot.
Right. The text cites Microsoft and Siemens actively retraining their workforce into AI operations. And there's that fascinating 2023 study by the economist Eric Brynjolfsson. It showed a massive 14% productivity boost for customer service agents who utilized AI support systems.
Brynjolfsson's study is a classic illustration of the Jevons paradox.
Remind us what that is.
Sure. William Jevons was a 19th century economist who noticed that making steam engines more efficient didn't reduce the consumption of coal. It actually made coal so cheap and useful that overall consumption exploded.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So in the modern context, if AI makes customer service agents wildly faster and more efficient, the cost of providing that service drops. The company can then afford to handle vastly more customer interactions, which means they actually retain their human staff to manage the increased volume.
So that's the most optimistic scenario for the worker. But I have to push back on this retraining narrative. If we look back at Van Valk's data, which shows AI advancing by over 8 percentile points a year across all these core skills, isn't retraining a paralegal to be a data analyst just playing a high-tech game of musical chairs?
This raises an important question, and the author completely agrees with your pushback. Retraining is a survival tactic at the micro level, but it is a zero-sum game at the macro level.
Because the chairs are still disappearing.
Yes. Let's say you take that displaced paralegal and spend a year retraining them to be a data analyst. You run smack into the mathematical reality that AI is already sitting at the 76th percentile for data analysis cost parity.
So you buy them, what, a few years?
You might buy that worker 3 to 5 years before they face the exact same displacement pressure in their new role.
For decades, economists have mocked people who worry about job displacement by citing the lump of labor fallacy. This idea that there's only a fixed amount of work in the world, and if a machine does part of it, we just run out of jobs. The economists have always said, no, human desire is infinite. We will invent new work.
But the lump of labor fallacy assumes that humans will be the ones performing the new work.
Right.
Van Valk's data suggests the AI is increasingly capable of taking over the new industries just as fast as they're invented. That's why companies are increasingly relying on a third strategy, pure restructuring.
Meaning achieving the same output with drastically fewer people.
Exactly. Look at UPS. They cut 12,000 back-office jobs, scheduling analysts, dispatchers,
Yeah.
but they kept their delivery drivers completely safe.
Because the physical act of driving a truck is still protected by more of X
Oh,
paradox?
same with Moderna. They shifted their hiring from document specialists to senior scientists. The company optimizes, but the mid-level knowledge worker is left out in the cold.
So, what does this all mean? If transparent communication just manages the bad vibes of being laid off, and retraining is just delaying the inevitable, and restructuring leaves the worker behind, how do we actually survive this?
The paper outlines some long-term fixes, and the first one requires us to completely change how we think about our own value.
Okay.
We have to stop asking, what can AI automate?
Uh-huh.
And start fiercely defending what is valuable because a human does it.
Yeah.
The market is going to place a premium on irreducibly human contributions.
Irreducibly human.
Yes. The Cleveland Clinic provides a brilliant model for this. They radically redesigned their nursing roles. They handed off the charting, the documentation, and the basic monitoring to AI tools.
Which our nurses usually hate doing anyway.
Exactly. But instead of using that efficiency to just fire nurses, they shifted the nurses' time entirely to longitudinal emotional support and patient relationships.
I love this. Because trust and authentic connection aren't just warm and fuzzy feelings, they are economic features. A patient might logically accept that an AI is better at analyzing their MRI, but they deeply want a human being, someone capable of genuine empathy, and someone who is legally accountable to sit in the room and walk them through the terrifying reality of a treatment plan.
If a job consists entirely of reproducible tasks, it is vulnerable. If it is anchored in ongoing relationships, ethical judgment, or community trust, it is highly durable.
But even if we pivot to those human-centric roles, hospital administrators and corporate boards still hold the purse strings. If an executive wants to fire the nurses anyway to boost quarterly profits, how do workers actually protect those human elements?
That requires the second long-term fix: distributed governance. Workers must have a structural seat at the table to negotiate the pace of automation. We saw this with the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike.
Right, the WGA strike.
The writers didn't attempt to ban AI entirely. They knew that was impossible. Instead, they demanded disclosure. They successfully negotiated contracts stipulating that AI could not be used to reduce the minimum size of a human writing team.
And the text points out that in other parts of the world, this kind of governance is already baked into the system, like German co-determination laws.
Exactly. Or look at the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain. It's a massive federation of worker cooperatives where the employees are the shareholders. When a new automation technology arrives at Mondragon, they don't use it to fire 20% of the staff to enrich a distant group of investors.
Because the workers are the investors.
Right. The worker owners vote to share the productivity gains. They might use the AI to shorten the work week without cutting pay, or use the profits to retrain their own members internally. When workers have structural power, displacement is slowed down and managed humanely.
Okay, but I want to get to the ultimate brutal, pragmatic question here. Let's look at the macro economy. What happens when the market clearing wage for median skills, like the actual dollar amount a company is willing to pay for an average worker's output? What happens when that falls below what a human being needs to literally pay rent and buy groceries?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Westover argues we must seriously examine social insurance and the decoupling of wages from basic survival.
Big concepts.
Yeah. If the free market will no longer pay a living wage for median cognitive work, society has to build a structural bridge. The paper examines pilots for universal basic income, or UBI, in places like Stockton, California, and Kenya, which provide a floor of unconditional cash. It also details the concept of job guarantees in public sectors.
A job guarantee, meaning the government acts as the employer of last resort for work that is socially vital but not necessarily profitable for private companies.
Exactly. Think of elder care, environmental restoration, or community building.
Yeah.
Human labor is immensely valuable there, but the free market doesn't adequately fund it. The paper also discusses expanding existing frameworks, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, to subsidize low-wage work.
And just to be completely clear to you listening, the source material presents this strictly as an economic distributional math problem. We aren't taking a political stance here.
No, not at all.
The paper is simply explaining a mechanism. If AI allows a corporation to produce 10 times the output with 1/10 of the human labor, an enormous amount of new wealth is generated. Society has a choice. That wealth can pool entirely at the top with the capital owners, or the productivity gains of the AI can be taxed, and that revenue can be circulated back into the local economy to fund things like job guarantees or UBI. It is a lever that exists if society decides the transition is too painful.
It is simply the math of a post-automation economy. The burden of proof has officially shifted. For 2 centuries, the pessimists had to prove why technology would cause lasting unemployment, and they were always wrong.
Right.
But now, Van Vocht's data shows AI saturating the entire skill taxonomy at once. The optimists are the ones who now have to prove why the historical escape routes will miraculously reopen.
Because the somewhere else we're all supposed to transition to is already learning how to do the job without us. Which means, for you, the listener, the transition ahead probably isn't going to look like a cinematic robot apocalypse. The Terminator isn't going to hand you a pink slip.
No, it's not that dramatic.
It's going to be exactly what we're already seeing, a slow, grinding adjustment. A tough market for recent graduates, stagnating wages for average performers, and shrinking departments. The absolute best thing you can do for your own career right now is to relentlessly pivot toward those irreducibly human skills. Focus on the relationships, the ethical judgment, the empathy, the trust.
Anchor your value in your humanity, not just your processing power.
And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over, building on that idea of occupational identity.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah. If our professional work identities are fundamentally devalued over the next decade, if average professional skills are entirely outsourced to algorithms,
Wow.
how is that going to shift our personal lives? Are we going to see a massive renaissance in analog hobbies?
Like woodworking or baking?
Exactly. Are we all going to start making our own furniture or joining community theater or planting massive urban gardens? Will we deliberately seek out tasks that are wildly inefficient and refuse to automate them, simply to reclaim the psychological joy of doing them ourselves? It's something to think about the next time someone brings up AI at the office. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one. Keep learning and keep questioning.